fire engineering is that in structural engineering, if you do a bad job, you're gonna get caught out quite early because the building is probably gonna collapse either during construction or like at the first strong wind. And actually, if you look at the evolution of bridges, that's how it happened. They kept building like thinner and thinner bridges, then one collapsed, and they're over-designed, and they had to innovate and change, but eventually they were caught out. But with fire engineering, because in a single building, a fire is a rare event. So in a single building, it might not be, a bad design might not be caught out within 10, 20 years. So you have a lot of space there for charlatans to move into the profession and sell their services.
Yeah, you know, that is a mistake that is made very often by trying to extrapolate the feedback loop that civil engineers have into fire engineering, which is not necessarily the same. So effectively, civil engineers have relied on failure as a feedback loop. So as you say, if you build a bridge and the bridge actually falls down, or you know, like it happened with the Millennium Bridge, it starts wobbling, you know, then people recognize that the design was inappropriate, and then you know, you disgrace yourself, and then you know, you have to redesign. So that is the mechanism that civil or structural engineering has used as a feedback loop to demonstrate that you have achieved, you know, correctly the objectives. That is not necessarily the same mechanism that we have in other engineering disciplines. So, you know, when you design a car, for example, you use prototyping. So in the case of mechanical engineers, their mechanism for feedback loop is prototyping and failure. So they design, they test, and then they verify, and then they come back and they come back and they come back, and once they're right, they can mass produce. So different disciplines have different feedback loops. Now, in fire engineering, you have a perfect example, you know, of the feedback loop that you embed in the system that allows you to know if you're designing the system correctly. So if you have a sprinkler system, you can actually do all sorts of tests to show that the sprinkler system works correctly. Okay, you don't have to wait until there's a fire to know if your sprinkler system is going to work correctly. We have embedded in the system mechanisms to test that the design was done right. Okay, and I think in a way we should not think that the ultimate failure, because the system is dormant, is the mechanism by which we're creating the feedback loop. Okay, so if we are going to have a dormant system, a proper design implies that we have created sufficient feedback loops that we can verify the design, and we don't need the fire to make sure that it actually is designed correctly. So of course, at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. So you're going to have the day of the fire, you're going to verify that ultimately your system is correct or not. But that doesn't mean that you could not do other area verification before. So we have to be careful not to mix methods that different disciplines use, because disciplines are distinct. You know, and this is why we have a professional body, why we have our own set of rules, because we have to implement our own set of rules that are appropriate for the system that we're working with. Okay, and I think that is the important thing. This is a very distinct and unique discipline, which will have its own feedback loops, its own methods, its own processes, its own techniques and technologies that cannot necessarily be coincidental with other disciplines like civil engineering. So if we were to operate like civil engineers and wait until the fire happens, you're absolutely right. You know, it will allow for 40 years of incompetence to filter through the system, like what has happened with the facades, no? So effectively, that's exactly what has happened with the facades. We built facades for 20 years, and only after we kill 72 people, we go, oops, you know, and that's a problem, okay?
Well, we have tests to test facade systems. The problem is someone came along and said like, oh, well, I'll just ignore that now, do a desktop study.
No, that's too simplistic. Please don't get into that level of simplicity, okay? So effectively, yes, you have desktop studies and you have tests, but tests are mechanisms of feedback loop. Okay. Now, if the test was used appropriately, you could have used a desktop study correctly. The problem is that you used the wrong test in the wrong way, you know, and extrapolated the wrong thing. But the bottom line is that all that at the core is basically proof that effectively the whole system was handled in an incredibly incompetent manner. Okay. Not necessarily that the components of the systems were incorrect. A test is a test. You know, the problem with the test is not the test, it's the way it's interpreted. If a test doesn't provide you much information, that basically means you have very little to work with. And you have to put a lot of intelligence and a lot of knowledge to be able to extrapolate. The problem is that we have a very poor test with a very poor practitioner, and when you mix the two of them together, you get a bomb. You know, and so, but let's try not to be simplistic because it's actually quite dangerous. You know, these are all the issues that normally should be discussed within a professional context. You know, and that's the need, you know, for a professional space. Yeah.
In wake of some accidents and also structural defects here locally in Australia, some states like Victoria and New South Wales, and I think Queensland is going to start that process of formalizing the engineering registration. So what's your comments on this? Basically, from the fire engineering.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the reason why I was describing this as a great moment to try to tackle all these things, because effectively, you know, people are recognizing the need to protect engineering as such, and Australia was actually pretty bad at not doing so. So in Australia, you don't need to be an engineer to behave or operate as an engineer, and it's only now that people are recognizing that you have to protect the status of an engineer, and this is why, you know, the ministers are going all around trying to say that they're going to start developing this. I mean, we've been, you know, with David Lang, we've been working on this, trying to push this, you know, for fire engineering, so we get included into the whole process. But yeah, I mean, I'm 100% in favor of it. The only risk, and this is why we need to be very alert, is that once you structure this, okay, if it's structured in an incorrect manner, you know, then what you've done is even worse than not having, you know, the appropriate protection. So we have to be very alert and very careful that if we get formalized as engineers and we actually have our proper protected space, that proper protected space is properly defined.
So do you think it is a good idea to put fire engineering in one spot? Because I operate as a fire engineer, but also my education background makes me a structural engineer as well. So sometimes we need to work on this interface, and do you think if you push it too hard?
No, look, you see, I don't have a problem at all with an individual having multiple specialties. Okay, so you can be a structural engineer and be accredited and be competent in structural engineering. And you can be a fire engineer and be competent and be certified as a fire engineer. Okay, you can have both. I have no problem with that. What I have a problem is when a structural engineer thinks it's a fire engineer. Okay, you know, and that's when you start. You basically have to check: do they actually have all the competencies that enable them, you know, to be able to exercise the profession of fire engineering? Okay, and that is a completely different story. You know, so you know, there's many people that operate in interfaces where you require the competencies of both. Okay, and that might be that you're certified in both, or you understand enough of the other that you can rely on another certified person to give you what you want. Okay, so at no point I'm saying that we cannot operate in the interface. All I'm saying is that if you want to be a fire engineer, you have to have the required competency to be one. Okay? Yeah.
I mean, so firstly, I completely agree with everything you've said, but
Thank you.
when you talk about,
Always, when somebody starts saying that they agree, that, you know, they're always the but. So what's the but?
So my but is that you talk about the divorces in structural and civil engineering, and they're effectively led by the leaders that you've given out, and we're now in a position where if we had these types of leaders in our profession, they obviously, I mean, if they were of that same caliber, that we would have our own space and our own body to operate in. So you've given this task onto us as young engineers and future graduates and whatnot. I mean, we're waiting for the pipe to eventually fill up, but there's still that inevitable time delay until, you know, we can get a leader that's capable of actually driving this kind of change and leading this kind of divorce from the firefighting profession. So what do we do with that?
That is already there. So I mean, you were in Chile,
Yeah.
you know, and you saw all the 80 and 90-year-olds in the first couple of days, no?
Yeah.
And then you saw the Bart Mercies and Guillermo Rines and all these people that came after.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the leadership of the pipeline.
Yeah.
Okay, and you are giving them the critical mass because they are, you know, a couple dozen people.
So they should do that. It should be Bart Mercer and Guillermo Rey doing the professionalization.
They won't have your support.
So they need the support, is what you're saying. So they need us to go into industry and effectively deliver this message.
Yeah. So it is a concerted thing. So you have technical leadership, you have all the components in there. But all these components need to work together.
Yeah.
Because they don't have the critical mass. They're the first generation coming in from what was completely an empty pipeline. Okay? And so effectively what comes behind is a pipeline that is beginning to fill up. And everybody should be pushing in the same direction, towards achieving it. So it's not only their responsibility, but they should be leading that responsibility, which they are. Because you have people like David Lang fighting in the Warren Center to try to get all these things. You have the same thing with Juan and the cladding issue here in Queensland, trying to push the idea of competency in that space. You have all these people. Bart Mercy with International Masters in Fire Safety Engineering. You have all these people, working in that space, and they are leading, but they need the critical mass, and the critical mass is people like you in the room. Okay, and all these people in a concerted way are going to be able to achieve it, but no individual can do it by itself.
Last question, because we have some.
Okay. Don't you think that there is also one problem in fire engineering that is very diverse and in the intersection of many other disciplines? Like we are going from wildfires to structural engineers to space safety, and I think that's also creates a bit of problem in merging all these in one discipline.
Of course, the more complex the discipline is, okay, the more difficult it is, and this is, you can see this with medical doctors, no?
Yeah, they have fragmented even
They get
more.
fragmented. But the truth is that a pediatrician will never exercise as a neurologist. Okay, because they've already fragmented themselves in a way that even within, the context of the medical profession, they have specialties that are very well recognized, and nobody will enter that monopoly. Okay, and I think in fire engineering potentially, like we already saw that split between structural fire engineers and fire protection engineers. So we have the people developing all the protection aspects of it, and then you have the people that are looking into structural behavior in fire. So already those specialties are carving themselves out, and we just simply need to be able to formalize them appropriately. Okay, so that was the last question. Thank you very much again.
Pizza, if you want to talk to Jose, can be here. And
Oh, by the way, if you haven't signed the list, please do so. It's over here on this table.
So, yeah, I still have like a lot of questions to ask him when I need to, because I think from his point, yeah, I think it is clear. You can look at the problem differently and say like, okay, this structure, this is the temperature that it can allow. Then the problem becomes
The issue with temperature is always like, where do you define the temperature? This is very different for steel or concrete building, because then you have the temperature gradient, and you have like an infinite amount of points where you need to consider your temperature, and you don't really know where your worst case is.
yeah.
So defining like safety by temperature is difficult because you don't really.
Yeah, so agree. So there will be like some of the things to come back.